This is Art International, April the 20th, 1967, and Christopher Finch begins a major article on me and my work, and it was almost like I was virtually impossible to actually place, you know, in this world of then Neoplatonism and the whole bit. But Christopher began by saying, Colin Self is a draftsman and sculptor operating quite outside the style snobberies which have become the politics of modern art. He is a modern artist, A, insofar as his subject matter is contemporary, bracket, in a very special sense, close bracket, and B, in that his viewpoint is strictly of today. He does not need to advertise his modernism by resorting to fragmentation or tarted up Neoplatonism. His exploitation of the stylistic conventions of contemporary art is minimal, but his acceptance of subjective and psychological insights is totally modern. And I phoned Christopher probably a year ago. He now lives in Los Angeles and that. And I said, do you know what? I said, that's the best definition of YBA I've ever read. And he went, it is, isn't it? And this is kind of like mid-60s. And he goes on. But it's really important because that's exactly what YBA did. And I mean, a lot of people in the art world younger, they've clocked me, and I want to sort of be devoid of the art world in a sense, and just paddle my own canoe. But I keep getting told by people of Jess and my twin daughter's generation, you know, well, you know, I don't think you really know the effect you've had and blah, blah, blah. And I kind of like, I take it sort of nicely, like sort of Geppetto finishing off his puppet of Pinocchio, but I just don't, I basically don't give a toss, but yeah, I do. And then when he gets down, you see, he talks to a lot, and then he gets to this, which I think is very significant. And this comes from my Piccadilly Gallery exhibition in November 65, but came from notes that I used to sort of scribble down and chuck in a drawer, and then I made a statement from them. But this is significant. This is 1967, this article. Drawing to me is an art, also skating, fishing, and putting the fish into a glass case for immortality. And that's quite significant, isn't it? I think it kind of announces me as an artist of the future, which is like the now or something. It's crazy, and I do think that definition is, you know, it's worth putting down, really. But it's all I wanted to say, because anyway, do we just chit-chat now? Or?
Yeah, no,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I thought
sorry.
now, because, you know, there's quite a lot to cover and everything.
Of course.
So I thought,
yeah.
and I know you were interested also in talking about your beginnings and everything. So I thought we could start just with, you know, your family background. I know that your father was he was a sign painter, and I think all your many brothers are all craftsmen. So what was it, do you think, that drew you into art? And do you think an artist is different from a craftsman? Do you see yourself as different?
I do.
You do?
Yeah. I think if I cast the net back a little bit, my father's family were Norwich back alley, really working class. And if I go back to 1821, I think my father's mother, she was a Plunkett, so that would originally be East Cork, I suppose. But they all lived in the poor area of Norwich, just inside the city walls. And my father's mother had three brothers. There was David Plunkett, there was Walter Plunkett, there was Ernest Plunkett, or the other way round. And up they come when the First World War is on, and they all sort of get their uniforms and off they go, and they're all kind of, you know, I think David was sort of came back as a cripple, and by 1921 or something was dead. My father's father was in the army virtually as a child in India, brought back for the First World War, gassed, dead by 1921. And I think Ernest Plunkett was blown up, and I don't even know if he's got a grave, but I think Walter Plunkett is in Belgium. And so basically you're talking about a Norwich back alley with no men. And so it was the women who brought the family up and did their best. And there were one or two tearaways in my father's older brothers. And I think what happened, I mean, I think my father just had to get a job at 14 or 15 or something, you know. And he was a sign writer and painter and decorator and a pub musician. And in pubs, you know, if you sort of go back to the old Norwich back alley accent, you know, it's like, God blast, what's Ernie playing up the brickmakers? And all the gang would pile in, and he had to be the centre of attention wherever he went. But he loved art, and I've got some stuff. I meant to show you examples, which you could film later, but I've got a fire screen and one or two bits. And to come up to World War II, my father's left arm was about, these fingertips were probably up to the base of his right hand. So he was in the reserves in the war, and his mother died when he was away in the reserves in the army. He never fought, you know, direct contact in World War II. And it turned out, it only dawned on me quite recently that his mother died on Christmas Day. And I've got letters from her, you know, they say it'll all be over by Christmas and we'll go over to the Oval pub and we'll all have some bevies. And they were all drinkers, you know, but not a nasty drinker amongst them. And he came back in the end, and he worked on an Italian prisoner of war camp about a quarter of a mile away from where we lived. And I can remember as a little tot, I was bright. And we had Italians like Alfonso Fortunato and Vincenzo Capasso and people, they'd be at the back door. And when I was sort of knee-high to a grasshopper, they'd, hey, Colin, you say Fangola. And I would walk around going, Fangola. And then suddenly after a couple of weeks, thinking I'm making adults laugh, you know, bang, you know, you mustn't say that, that's naughty. And think, what have I done? And when the war ended, Vincenzo Capasso was a carpenter, and he made a lovely octagonal parquetry a tray and gave it to my dad as a parting present. And Alfonso Fortunato, I've got a painting by Alfonso, who was Sicilian, and apparently and they wrote to each other. And then Alfonso wanted to come back and work for my dad as a painter and decorator, but that never happened. And I've got their exchanges of letters. And then the other one was Salvador Borelli, who I've got a painting by him. And so when I was a little kid, if I went into the front room of our little bungalow, I had actually like real art. And then there was also a pacifist, a religious guy called Aubrey Plumstead, who I had a painting. My uncle Len, my mother's brother, was sort of in the RAF in Belgium, and he was ground crew for tank bombers, for tank busters, you know, the Typhoon aeroplanes. And because he had colour blindness, he couldn't tell the difference between red and green, so he couldn't be a pilot. And that was a huge influence, because he made a model of the Typhoon, and the wheels came down just with scrap wood and that. And every Christmas, if we were up their bungalow, he'd get this out and get the cotton wool off, and he'd show there was this aeroplane and you were allowed to hold it. And he was an old bachelor, and to me it was art. And because of his colour blindness, it always struck me that, you know, not at that time when I was 5 or 4, but later in life I thought, God, Uncle Len, he was like a landlocked builder of ships, you know. He wanted to do the thing he wanted to do, which was to be a flyer of those tough aeroplanes to control, you know. And I always saw it as a work of art. And then also he did, above photo frames, you know, above a photograph of himself, he made those aluminium aeroplanes. And it just struck me that he was an artist. He ended up as a jobbing coppersmith, you know, and stainless steel worker as a proper job when he left the war. But so I always did see aeroplanes, why shouldn't you make art of them? It was natural. And with my education, you know, I was doing, I wrote things, and I used to write a lot, and I never had a radio when I lived in London and lived in cheap accommodation. South Villas Camden Square was one, which is now sort of Millionaire Row, but 35 shillings a week for the garret. And then Ladbroke Grove, you know, I think it went up to sort of £2 a week. And my bed was higher than the windowsill, so I could look down on the street, and I used to almost write plays. Whoever walked past, I'd just write, you know, man in something, women in high-heeled shoes, and I've still got these things in an early sketchbook. And in fact, I used to call them street scene, and it's where the name of this exhibition came from. And so I suppose I was way ahead. And I used to think to myself lateral thoughts like, well, the Romans could make sort of somebody galloping or a galloping horse, or even the Persians could do war scenes in low relief. And I thought, why shouldn't I just do like war? And I'd been mind blown from the threat of nuclear annihilation and all of that. So that was my grounding. It wasn't easy for me. I'm the oldest of 9 born children. And I went to a really good boarding school in Norfolk, a co-educational boarding school, which is now sort of probably better than Gresham's, apparently. I went to Wyndham College, and it was very good in many ways because everybody was limited to the same amount of pocket money. The only ways that somebody, like if somebody was tall, if somebody was a really good bowler at cricket, or if someone was a good rugby player, you know, there were certain ways, or if someone was funny, or if someone was good at maths, like 93%, and I'd be getting like 18%, and I used to think, who the fuck are these people? How do they do it? But I got a 4 in the end because we had brilliant teachers. And we had engineering drawing, which was amazing, and which was orthographic projection, isometric projection, true lengths, rebatments, loci. I did all that engineering stuff just when I was, like 13, 14, 15. And we had a headmaster who was called Mr. Metcalf, a big bull of a man with a bald head and just very fine hair at the sides. And he would get onto the stage, for morning assembly. And we used to take the piss at him, to put it crudely, and behind his back. We called, and some of these Norfolk lads, they called him Mussolini. And, bloody Mussolini, what he say there? God, bloody hell, and all this. But his big speeches used to be, he'd get on stage and want us to aspire as a school. And whatever next? Next, you'll be eating fish and chips on the street corner, out of newspaper, and this was like the worst that you could ever see. We all used to sort of be, but it was an aspirational school, and mainly parents' cars. Parents could go nowhere near the school, so you didn't know that my dad didn't even have a car, and you didn't know that somebody else's dad might have a Jaguar or something. Everyone got the same amount of pocket money. Everyone had to write a letter home every week, which is where I got my letter writing from, I suppose. It's just nice to get inside your mind and sort of relate thoughts, to a blank piece of paper. And it was a meritocracy. And the shocks came later. And my mother had 9 kids, and my mother could kind of nag for England. My dad was always up the pubs, but not a nasty, vicious drunk. None of the Bellamys or the Plunketts. There wasn't a nasty drunk amongst them. They just were sort of Saxon drinkers who liked to get a bit merry and have the game of darts and all that, and sing-alongs. But when I wanted to go to the art school, I didn't know there were things called art schools. And we had a tall, willowy girl in our art class. And the first 2 teachers who taught me were rubbish. They absolutely, I don't know if they saw I was gifted and just went anti me. And I even got 1 or 2 snotty reports, And it put me off. And then we got a man called Mr. Freeman, who used to deliberately walk with his Bachelor of Arts gown on, and one shoulder would be up, and he was like arty, you could see, and he did sword fencing, and he had 78 RPM black jazz records from the 30s and the 40s. It was just, he was good. And then one day there was a tall, willowy, balletic looking girl, and she was going to go to St. Martin's. She'd got a prospectus, and I didn't even know there was things like art schools, and he was walking around. It's one of the best art schools in the country, and I thought, a school where you do art, and I thought, I daren't go to London, you know, I daren't go all that way, and then a couple of kids came up, Roger Fisk and Lenny Boothby, and they got prospectus, or prospecti, is it, from Norwich Art School, and I thought, what? And they went, Wyndham College dragged me back to the sixth form. They knocked on my door in the first Christmas holidays, and they said, we're taking you up the art school. And I just thought, they're leaving me behind. So I went to Wyndham and sort of resigned, as it were. And then I wanted to go, and the principal, I'd wanted to go in the summer, but the school tugged me back. And I went and saw the principal for the second time, and he says, and he was a Huddersfield man with sort of Geppetto glasses, and you change your mind a lot, don't you? But well, get yourself a grant first, and you can come. And so I literally was so naive. I literally was waiting for my grant to come, and it came about, I think, February the 8th, 1958, and this was 6 weeks into the term. And when I turned up, all the kids thought I was cool, like he doesn't come till he gets his dosh first. And I was the opposite. But in that time I was doing jobs in the garden and stuff and sawing logs, and my mum, who had a vicious temper, opened the kitchenette window and just screamed at me like, why don't you bugger off back to bloody boarding school where you belong? And I think my brains kind of snapped, you know. And I was actually, as the oldest of 9 born children, I was kicked out of home 16, 18 times into the night, you know. And
so did that make you want to go to London? Do you think that was
Not really. No. It was awful. I mean, you wouldn't treat a dog like it, but like my parents could argue for England and stuff, you know, and about nothing really, but just pressure. And my dad was just a boozer, a happy-go-lucky sort of boozer. And sometimes I'd ride around the county at night, or a few times I broke into the art school. I'd have to leave a toilet window just on the button. And once or twice, one of the students, Hank Kennedy, his mother had a house on stilts at Wroxham on the river, and 2 or 3 times we'd go there. And a couple of times I had a quid so I could stay at the YMCA. And it was a tough upbringing. And in the end, Mr. Noel Spencer, the principal, he saw me looking downhearted, and he said, come into the office. And he said, your father's been up here again. And I said, what? He's been up here again? He said, that's the 3rd time he's been up to the art school. He said, he's trying to force me to force you to leave. And he said, but I won't do that. He said, I'm going to find you lodgings. Excuse me. And that's how I got there. And then the first year of the degree thing, the diploma, so I'd got my intermediate, and the first week we had this person come in, tall and very cack-handed and left-handed like I am, with a sharp nose and quite a tall man, but long legs and a sort of smaller body, and he was called Mike Andrews. And some of the students who sort of fancied themselves were big ginger beards, and they'd like to call him Mike and all this. And coming from Wyndham College, I would always call him Sir Mike. And apparently Mike and Bill Fever later on, you know, in life, they would sort of have giggles about Mike would sort of take the piss behind my back about. And on my first day live painting, there was a guy called David Kent, who leaned across to my palette and looked and counted 23 colours, and he then said, he said, Suzanne only had 18, and I moved to the other side. And when Mike came round, I said, sir, I said, somebody's sort of taken the mickey at my palette. I said, I don't know what colours. And he chose them. He said, we don't need that, we don't need these like purples. And he basically got me Sir William Coldstream's palette. And I had the cheek or the insight when he finished. I said, sir, I said, you couldn't sit down and paint a bit for me, could you? And he sat down and he painted, and he was just going like, can you see a T shape on her left shoulder? It was a back view. And I said, yeah. He said, no, I think that contains, he said, white. And he said, I think it contains raw umber, or not raw umber, it was like yellow ochre, and then a bright red, and it just went like ping, might have been a yellow. And it was just the colour, and he just made that mark. And he said, if you come down, he said, it's a bit colder. He said, no, I think that contains, it's got terra vert. And he made that mark. And I said, well, what happens when you get to the edge? And he said, oh, forget edges. And also we got Jeffrey Camp as a teacher, 2 real artists. And Jeffrey was always about the golden mean and work the shapes out and all that 50s stuff where there would be such a distortion. You think, that's not a person, you know, like, but the shape was right with another shape. And when I said this worry about composition, Mike simply sort of replied with, well, he said, I simply feel that composition is where one happens to place things. And I said, I'm so slow. And he said, so am I. He said, it takes as long as it takes. And when he left, I thought, no one's going to see the join. And he became my complete hero, you know, which was, that's how I did it. And I heard this Slade word being mentioned. And I thought, Slade, what's this? There's what? And there was Ian Chance and Roger Challoner, and they got in the Slade. And I thought, well, there's only 6 weeks before they're going to enter. And I thought, right, from now on, I'm working not for this year because I'll get rejected. And I thought, I'm working for next year. And I got in, but it was antiseptic. It was my first real shocks of class divide and all that crap.
Did you encounter a lot of class consciousness at the Slade?
At first, I had more of a drawl, you know, like some people think some Norfolk people can tell I'm Norwichy, but I was in no man's land between the rural county, and yet my dad's family were kind of like Norwich back alley, and the Norwich accent, you know, the shoe factories and things, you know, it'd be, what? And it was like really like this thing, oh, we ain't got to do that, is he? And they were rebellious working people, and like if someone got told off at work, you know, between the workers, the name of the boss would be Pissquick. And you never guess what old Pissquick say to me. And if Pissquick came along with the assistant manager, that used to be Pissquick and useless. And this was the Norwich people, the down-to-earth, what they thought about the others. And I was in between sort of the county and the city, if you would. And Jess and I, she's Yorkshire, but not with a strong Yorkshire accent. We seem to find each other's bits out, if you know what I mean, in more ways than one. Yeah. So that was the Slade, and I the first.
So did you feel somewhat of an outsider compared with your fellow students? Were there?
I tell you what I got. I used to get. I say, are you Australian? And I used to say, what? No, I'm from Norwich, you know, or sometimes Norfolk, you know, and they look puzzled, and I say, is that now Gloucester? You know, and they'd be really like these fucking Southern white English twats, you know, they can shove it. And the first person I spoke to actually was Telfer Stokes, ex-Bryanston, whose mother was an adorably brilliant constructional artist using driftwood, you know, that Margaret Mellis, is it? Is it Margaret Mellis? And his father, apparently it turned out, was Adrian Stokes. So on my first day...
The writer, Adrian Stokes.
Yeah, critic on art.
Yeah.
And this is Telfer, ex-Bryanston Public School. And I'd sort of like in Norwich, you'd go, hello, you know, and I'd say, hello. And off they go with their fucking snouts in the air, you know, and all this. And this kind of, I had quite a bit of that. Then there was a girl, and they were all painting in this Sladey way. I remember this girl, sort of like slightly Degas would have painted her with the long sort of frizzy hair, a big bundle at the back and that. And she was doing this like, I'm painting at arm's length, like on the easel, you know, and all this sort of stuff. Another one didn't speak. You think, what the hell? And there was a brilliant guy there called Terry Atkinson who became... I was threatened with failure. And my work was put by Andrew Forge, ex-Bryanston, into the worst 3 students at the Slade. And yet it's odd because quite a lot of that, some is now in the Tate, some is in Pallant House Gallery, Chichester.
But it's quite odd just to have that category, isn't it?
Yes. And one was a marvellous guy, a big tall guy with blonde hair. He was one of Adolf Hitler's experiments, you know, like the 100 most blonde Teutonic women and the 100 most... God, he was a lovely guy. And he went out with a Malayan woman called Maisie, but he was in the worst three. And then the other one was a Grimsby girl with sort of square specs and an engagement ring. And I don't know if her father had a couple of fishing boats or something from the fish trade. And, you know, hey, when I leave, my boy is engaged. You know, we're gonna get married. And then I had a thing. There was an eccentric Norwich guy who was quite visionary and quite aggressive and used to snort down his nostrils, David Rand, and he was a student at the Royal College. And he would hang around the art school on a Monday morning with a Royal College scarf before he would drive down in a quite a wealthy girlfriend's sports car. And when the model had a break one Monday morning, you know, there's Rand in the toilet sort of propping the wall up, and I'm having a pee, you know, and he used to sniff and snort, you know. You know, I tell you what, Colin, he said, I'll tell you what, he said, we got this new student at the Royal College. He said, he's going to be fucking great one day. And he said, he's queer. And he said, he's from up North Yorkshire, Bradford. And he said, and he writes fuck and piss and blandine and you know, I'm a queer. And he writes all this stuff. He said he's going to be fucking great one day.
Hockney.
And I was kind of like Jules et Jim, you know, and I was a bit sort of like, you know, La Dolce Vita and those fantastic Italian films, and why did they ever stop making them? I used to go into Norwich Library every Saturday afternoon on my own after pottery finished, and I would always get Paul Cézanne, who's my ultimate hero, and I'd get the letters of Vincent van Gogh or Van Gogh, and I would get Jackson Pollock. And I would go, and there's only me and the librarian for about 18 months, you know, every Saturday. Oh, the same three again. And I would just bore holes in these, and I'd read Vincent van Gogh's things, and I would look at the Grand Bathers and is it Le Stark, was it? The Mont Saint Victoire. And I would just bore holes in these things, and I would read about how lonely Jackson Pollock was and how cold New York was, you know, in that period, and the whole bit, and then I would just leave, you know. But
so it must have been quite a relief when you left the Slade, and then you stuck around in London for a few years. And what was that sort of London art world like at the time? I know you exhibited at the Robert Fraser Gallery, and I think you actually dedicated your book.
I did.
To him, Colin Self's Colin Self. So presumably he was quite important to you.
Very. The dawn actually came at the Slade when one Slade hop, every now and then we had Slade hops, and once I was coming down, there was a staircase that went up and then it went either way, and I was coming down this one, and there was David Rand coming into the Slade, and in tow was Hockney and a couple of other dudes, and he saw me and he went, "Self, let me see your work." So I took him to my space, you see, and I showed him, and there's David Rand posing and looking at the work on the easel and making these great statements as he always did. And it reminds me of Sidney Nolan, it reminds me of surrealism. Don't like surrealism, don't like Sidney Nolan, don't like it. And all the time Hockney was going through a pile of my drawings, you see, and right when Rand finished his negative speech, you see, Hockney just looked up and David just sort of went, well, I think it's very good. And Rand shut the fuck up, and I kind of became friends with Hockney. And London actually, pre the 60s, it was pretty bloody grim, you know, it hadn't got over World War II, even by 1960 or 61. And there were dark alleys, there were sort of like Irish hostels, there was the odd drunk on a tube train, you know, would nearly almost like mess themselves and so drunk, and there would be the odd sort of person walking around the streets, you know, like this, and there was a circle where humanity never went, and wherever they walked and went, there was always this, you know, and it was, and being young and being a sort of macho man in a cold, tough city was quite a thing, pardon me, and but at Norwich Art School, we had a guy whose father was Munich, I think, and his mother was posh English, and before the war, she'd go skiing lessons. And Hank Kennedy, he was a muscle builder. And he was about 6'3" and blonde. And I can remember one evening in the fashion department at Norwich Art School, he stripped off and he was doing all this. And I thought, what the fuck? He looks like one of those people. And he emigrated eventually to Canada, and he ran magazines. He knew sort of stars. He'd go to Hollywood and stuff. And he went with another guy, and much married, and a womanizer. And he was sort of friends with Arnie Schwarzenegger, and he died about 2 years ago. He was a huge influence, but just the weight training. We'd have competitions, and he would show us how to do weight training. So I could sort of look after myself, you know, if ever it needed to happen. But London was cold, actually, and it was kind of macho. And I worked at the Slade on a series of stuff that it was only by the time, 25 years later, I realised I called them the stations of life. And one was humanity hanging on a thread. One was a hunt ball, which was class. And everything I'd done at the Slade actually was on a sophisticated level. That's The Trouble with the Bastards, my first nuclear thing. And I was on a higher level than the staff could recognise, you know.